Hi, I hope you'll enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners who contribute either through Patreon or directly on our Buzzsprout website. I'd like to thank Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, Mikhail Legner, Abigail and Noah Broyles, and Rosa. Thank you. Hi, welcome to another episode of the Lutheran History Podcast. As you may have heard me mention earlier in the year, this is going to be a WELS history-heavy year of podcast for the 175th anniversary. And I have to say that right now when I'm recording is maybe the high watermark of that WELS 175th anniversary. Right now, as we speak, the WELS Synod Convention is taking place, and its theme is Christ Through Us. The 175th anniversary is taking center stage. I actually had to pause the keynote essay on WELS history just to do this podcast on WELS history. And Dr. Grundmeier, I don't know if you saw it, but I got the Concordia Historical Institute Journal today for the summer edition. Its whole content is Synod history. So it is.
And I have
it's all
not seen
happening.
that yet.
Yeah. So there's more. There's even more to talk about someday if I get into those articles as well. But welcome back, Dr. Grundmeier. We're happy to have you join us today, and I think we're going to talk about an article of yours that appeared early in the year, kind of started off the year talking about the relationship of Wisconsin with its kind of mother synod in the Pennsylvania Synod. So with that rambling introduction, thanks for joining us again today.
Well, thanks for having me, Ben. This is always a lot of fun. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we're already warmed up, ready to jump right into it now. So first question, what inspired you to write this article about Wisconsin and Pennsylvania Synod?
Yeah, so I was doing research for a book project of mine, digging into a lot of the periodicals of the Lutheran Church in the Eastern United States. One of them's the Lutheran and Missionary, which was published in Philadelphia. And I came across this article. It was written in 1869 that talked about how the Pennsylvania Synod had done so much for the poor, struggling Wisconsin Synod. And I thought to myself, what are they talking about here? And it was one of those things where it's like you file it away, you kind of put it in the back of your mind, and maybe you'll come back to it later. And then must have been a year and a half ago, Joel Otto at Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary reached out to me and said, we're putting together articles for the 175th anniversary. Do you have anything you'd like to write about? And I said, well, I'd kind of like to explore this relationship between the Pennsylvania Synod and the Wisconsin Synod more. And he said, go for it. And I was a little nervous because I was kind of proposing an article on a hunch, that I'd find more. But I ended up not being disappointed at all. I mean, so many of the rabbit holes I went down had lots of things to find. And at one point I, reached out to him. I thought this was going to be a shorter, 15, 20 page article. It's like, I have so much stuff here. I don't know. But they were very generous. Let me write a longer article. So that was very kind of them. So apologies to readers for its length, but hopefully if you stick with it, you might learn a thing or two.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I was shamed when I looked at my article length, how small it was in comparison to yours.
Levity is the soul of wit, actually. So,
well, that could be said for that. But no, I think it, and again, a lot of primary research, again, kind of the thing that I think both of us get excited about, discovering new sources, new angles, and the fact that it is, if not making a new argument, maybe a long buried argument. And I think that's maybe what I want to talk about next is you mentioned in your article how it offers a reinterpretation of many WELS history narratives, including some of the very earliest WELS narratives. So what are some of the key corrections or shifts you're hoping this research and article will bring to WELS historiography?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, kind of how I think of it is the traditional story about the early history of the Wells has two major emphases. The first is the movement away from the German mission societies, which supplied many pastors to the United States, including those who joined the Wisconsin Synod. So the Wisconsin Synod's movement away from that theological position, which they came to regard as unsound, especially in regards to the questions of, say, church fellowship and confessional subscription. And so that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is the movement toward the Missouri Synod. As the Wisconsin Synod is moving away from these German mission societies, they develop a partnership with the Missouri Synod in the late 1860s, and this eventually forms into the Synodical Conference, and that fellowship lasts for almost 90 years. And so those are the two big points of emphasis. And what I'm trying to show in my article is that you cannot discount, and in fact, in many ways, you need to put right at the center this other important factor, and it's the Wisconsin Synod's early relationship with Lutheran church bodies in the eastern United States, the most important of which was the Pennsylvania Synod or the Pennsylvania Ministerium. It goes by both names. And so that's the point of my article, is trying to put the Pennsylvania Wisconsin relationship back at the center of how we understand the early history of the WELS. And by that, I mean not just the Wisconsin Synod, but also the Minnesota Synod, which also eventually merges with the Wisconsin Synod.
Yeah, and
That makes sense?
yeah, it does. So what I guess maybe I didn't catch it, but what is the main narrative is basically there's no Pennsylvania at all
Yeah,
mentioned.
or
It's
right. Or if there is a mention, it's like, oh yeah, this is interesting. Like the new Wells pictorial history, for example, has a couple mentions on how was Pennsylvania Synod sent some monetary support to the Wisconsin Synod. And so it's not as if Wells historians weren't aware that there was some connection here. I guess my argument is that it's much deeper and pronounced than we previously had thought. And I think some of the sources that really previously we haven't looked at kind of bear that out.
yeah, and that's in contrast to basically some Germans show up and there's a bunch of mission society from Germany
Right.
doing it. So the Wisconsin both I guess the thing in common is both narratives have the Wisconsin Synod is in dire need of support, right? Financially and called worker pastors especially. Um, but who's giving that support? You're adding a whole bigger dimension. Yeah.
Right. And it's not just what I'm trying to emphasize to the supplying of monetary aid, and maybe we can talk about what that looks like later on here, or even the people that come into the Wisconsin Synod that had these previous uh, Eastern connections. Um, it's also that in many ways the Pennsylvania Synod is in some ways shaping the Wisconsin Synod's early theological development. In many ways, the Wisconsin Synod mirrors the Pennsylvania Synod's move to a more confessionalism. It's just at the very end, kind of at the height of the partnership between the Wisconsin Synod and Pennsylvania Synod, the Wisconsin Synod goes a step further and joins with the Missouri Synod. So
Yeah.
that's also part of the story too. It's not just this outside group that's throwing a little bit of money at the Wisconsin Synod. There's a deeper partnership there.
Yeah. And maybe that surprises people because at least, simple narrative is, well, the East Coast, those are the quote unquote American Lutherans, which I know you don't like that term for various
Yeah,
reasons, but it's almost like, well, those are the English speaking ones. What would this German, more newer immigrant group even possibly have in common with them? How could they even work together? Um, and maybe that's why the American Lutherans, American born doesn't mean you can't speak German or you don't interact with your more recent immigrant.
Right.
groups.
And I mean, even the Pennsylvania Ministerium or Pennsylvania Synod, its official name had German in the title up until the I think 1861. It was the German, I'm not going to get it all right here, like the German Evangelical Lutheran Ministerium of Pennsylvania and
Yeah.
adjacent states or something along
Hmm.
those lines. So yeah, the Pennsylvania Ministerium, sometimes called the Mother Synod of American Lutheranism, because it was the first Lutheran church body in the United States, founded in the colonial era. But it's also the church body that so many other synods kind of sprang from in the Eastern United States. But they also had this idea, the Mother Synod of Pennsylvania, that kind of a big part of their mission was to support all these German immigrants coming to the United States in the antebellum era, that, they need help, they need support, and it's the Mother Synod's responsibility to help as much as they can.
Yeah, and I think as I mentioned briefly in the Muehlhäuser episode we did, I saw parallels with Friedrich Winiken, kind of the sole pastor showing up with a buddy from a mission society, go through the Pennsylvania Synod, get funding and direction for a while, and well, he goes his own way too. But kind of a parallel story of Pennsylvania's taking ownership of the need of other Lutherans far beyond Pennsylvania itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and maybe it's worth kind of bringing up there, what role do the mission societies play in the United States? I mean, the most basic role they play is they send pastors over. And there still is some contact between them. I mean, and this varies from different pastor and different mission society. But a lot of it is like just getting them over there to do the work. But once these new immigrant pastors come to the United States, they kind of have to make their own connections. I mean, you see that in Muehlhäuser, but many other of these pastors. So I think that's why it's important to emphasize the Pennsylvania Synod and other Eastern Lutheran story with regards to the Wisconsin Synod, because it's kind of it's one more layer in this complicated relations.
Yeah, so maybe let's flesh that out a little bit. In what ways, maybe a bit more specifically, financially, institutionally, theologically, any or all the above, did the Mother Synod of Pennsylvania shape the Wisconsin Synod?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that probably the part that gets mentioned in previous Wisconsin Synod histories, probably the most famous of which is J.P. Kaler's History of the Wisconsin Synod, is the financial piece. And so that's not totally new I'm bringing out, although I think even there, the extent of it maybe was maybe not as known. Um, I mean, basically what happens from the mid 1850s to 1867, the Pennsylvania Synod is sending several $100s, which in those days is not a small chunk of change, to the Wisconsin Synod annually to basically supplement the income of Wisconsin Synod pastors. I've kind of described it to some people. It's almost like the Pennsylvania Synod is giving what we today call mission enhancements to these mission congregations, right? They're not fully funding these mission pastors in Wisconsin's salaries, but they're supplementing them. And so what I discovered though is every year, beginning in the 1850s, the Wisconsin Synod sends a long report back to the Pennsylvania Synod that gets printed in their official minutes, detailing the activities of these pastors. And the kind of aha moment for me is they're they're being referred to in the Pennsylvania Synod minutes, the published proceedings, as our missionaries in Wisconsin, and similar language like this. So it's not as if like, oh, there's just these nice people in Wisconsin we're sending a little money to. This is actually a deep partnership. And again, the title of my article is Pennsylvania's Youthful Daughter, and that comes from one of these reports where Johannes Muehlhäuser, the president of Wisconsin Synod, says in his report, our dear Wisconsin, something along these lines. Our dear Wisconsin Synod is the youthful daughter of your synod, right? In other words, it's almost this kind of mother synod, daughter synod relationship. And so I think so the financial piece is part of this larger story. I mean, there's also the connections with personnel. I mean, I think some people, that have studied early Wisconsin Synod history kind of have the impression that, oh, these German pastors come from basically the Wisconsin Synod is just these German pastors that came from these mission societies and started a synod in Wisconsin. Well, there are some that come directly, but there's some that first serve in these other American Lutheran synods. Muehlhäuser is one, but there's other examples. There are some early pastors in the Wisconsin Synod that come from some of these Eastern church bodies. And then there's also like the institutional connections. For a time, the Wisconsin Synod is partnering with the seminary in Gettysburg, which has a German professorship, which is basically endowed by the Pennsylvania Synod. And so the idea is like, well, we need to train homegrown pastors. Where are we going to send them? Well, we'll send them to Pennsylvania, our closest partner. And then I think I mentioned this earlier, like there's in many ways where the Wisconsin Synod and Pennsylvania Synod share a very similar theological outlook. It's something that in the 1850s, Philip Schaff, who's a prominent church historian in the United States, originally from Switzerland, he calls it the moderate Lutheran tendency. And so both the Pennsylvania Synod and Wisconsin Synod kind of share that theological outlook. And if you want, I can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But I've kind of
Yeah, I think we hit
monologued.
that. Yeah, that's fine. No, it's good. I think we hit that in another episode, but yeah, let's briefly just talk about that distinction. I think as many times as it needs to be told, I think it's useful for
Yeah.
our audience.
Yeah. So there's kind of three-part division was first, as far as I can tell, put forward by, I mentioned him, Philip Schaff. He gives these lectures in Germany on basically what German Protestants in the United States are doing. He focuses a lot on the Reformed because he's a German Reformed, but he focuses a lot on the Lutherans too. And he says there's basically three types of Lutherans in the United States. He's writing here in the 1850s. There's the new Lutherans, and these are the people like Samuel Schmucker, Benjamin Quartz, people that are key leaders in the General Synod who are trying to you might say, downplay certain Lutheran distinctives, even alter perhaps the Augsburg Confession, especially its language around the sacraments. They're interested in cooperating with American evangelicals. And so that's the new Lutherans. Then there's the old Lutherans, Schaff says, these are usually identified with the Missouri Synod, and they believe in unconditional subscription to the Lutheran confessions, that there needs to be full doctrinal agreement before church fellowship. And then you have this third group, the moderate Lutherans, who are kind of in between. They're not on board with the Schmucker Courts project of changing the Augsburg Confession. They're a little wary about cooperating with American evangelicals, but they're also convinced that these old Lutherans are too exclusive, and they put too much emphasis on complete doctrinal agreement, and that's really where the Wisconsin Synod and Pennsylvania Synod are at in the 1850s. But what I try to show in the article is that at the same time that the Pennsylvania Synod is moving in a more, if you will, confessional direction, this is also happening in the Wisconsin Synod. And it's in many ways, and this is going to culminate in the formation of the General Council. So in many ways, the Wisconsin Synod is, I don't know if I want to say led along by the Pennsylvania Synod, but they're definitely on the same, in many ways, on the same trajectory as the Pennsylvania Synod. And that's especially happening during the 1860s, amidst the Civil War. And then, and again, as I mentioned, culminating in the formation of the General Council in 1867, which is meant to be this kind of more confessional alternative to the General Synod, which is the largest federation in Lutheranism at the time. Yeah, does that?
Yeah. that makes sense. And I think maybe we'll talk more about um, just the confessional attitudes of both synods in a minute. But I think just an
Yeah,
observation I had that maybe others might find helpful is, we've talked about mild, moderate, and old. And
yeah,
my simplification maybe used to be is that, well, the mild Lutherans were kind of the radical, theologically liberal ones, right? General Synod, and well, the old ones, well, those are the conservative ones, and moderate ones. I just thought, well, they're kind of the indifferent. They don't really have an opinion, but that's not really true at all.
right.
Especially looking at Pennsylvania and Wisconsin at this time, it was more of a tempered confessionalism. We want to be confessional. We want to stick with this. It's on a spectrum. They seem to be closer to the old Lutherans than
Yeah.
the mild
Although
ones in general.
I
I
think
don't
that's
know.
I think that's right. Although what's interesting is that the Pennsylvania Synod makes the kind of interesting decision in 1853 to join the General Synod. And that's a decision that is one thing that separates the Wisconsin Synod and Pennsylvania Synod. The Wisconsin Synod never joins the General Synod, although interestingly the German mission societies are asking the Wisconsin Synod, why don't you join the General Synod, which is kind of interesting. But I would say that in the 1850s, most in the Pennsylvania Synod, from my reading, see more disagreement with the old Lutheranism than the new Lutheranism,
Hmm.
because just the exclusivity as they see it, the doctrinal rigidity is such a, if you will, turn off compared to, well, some of these new Lutherans have, gone off the rails a little bit when it comes to, you know, abandoning certain aspects of Lutheran confessions. But, as long as they don't make this a binding thing, we can agree to disagree. And it's important to have this kind of united Lutheranism. That's what really begins to change in the 1860s, is that people who used to be moderate Lutherans really kind of, that moniker kind of falls away. And instead, I mean, one term I've discovered in my research is that increasingly you have this label of old school Lutheranism coming into being, which is basically many former moderate Lutherans taking a more, you might say, confessional approach to the questions that, we were just discussing when it comes to, yeah, confessional subscription, church fellowship, these kind of things. And so, yeah, so in some ways, you're right. I'd say the moderate Lutherans in the end are closer to the old Lutherans, but they kind of take a while to get to that point, if that
Sure.
makes sense.
And I
Yeah,
guess I'm thinking of the point to place in time of the moderates are the ones the ones we would still call moderates are the ones who form the General Council, which is
right,
set up explicitly in opposition to the General Synod, which is
right.
the mild. So I guess it depends on you're saying it depends on when and
Yeah,
who,
right.
which
And
is
I would
always a
say,
good historian caveat there,
yeah, and
right?
so this is like how much of a, how much of a parser of things do you want to be? But yeah, I would say when the General Council is formed, people that used to be called moderate Lutherans have kind of abandoned that label of moderate Lutheranism. They're not really calling themselves that anymore. They're calling themselves old school Lutherans, confessional Lutherans, strict Lutherans, take your
Yeah.
pick. So it is, I mean, we've talked about this before, Bentley. What I love about this period in American Lutheran history is the flux of things. It's,
The Wild West
yeah,
feel.
I mean,
Yeah.
so many things are up in the air when it comes to Lutheran identity, when it comes to, even just like ecclesial partnerships, which again kind of ties into the Wisconsin Synod's story during this time period too.
Yeah. I guess I'll make one quick comment and try to bring it back to your article. But yeah, just how you use those labels. I'm thinking of now that you're suggesting kind of a time progression. Um, Even the General Synod maybe even moves from being mild to predominantly moderate. I'm thinking of a guy like John
Yep,
Gottlieb Morris, who is very critical of Schmucker. I'm like, oh,
yep,
this guy must surely be a general council guy. No, he's the president of the General Synod
yeah.
for years, and he's very. Let's go back to the Lutherans on confessions for the sacraments, for example, and yeah, so that things do change and
You
people
know,
change.
you're right. It really is, right. The general, yeah. And again, this is a story I'm, um, in my book project, I tell the General Synod really becomes, abandons many of the positions of, say, that we often think of Samuel Schmucker as like the quintessential General Synod figure.
Hmm.
But after Schmucker passes away, the General Synod really begins to move away from that, its kind of positions of the 50s. And yeah, I think you're right. It becomes kind of almost similar to the moderate Lutheranism of the pre-Civil War years. But yeah, no, that's
Hmm.
a great observation.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can talk more about Pennsylvania and Wisconsin again. And I guess one of my questions is how much of this is a Muehlhäuser thing? I think mo many of the strengths of your argument saying this is our mother synod, you're quoting directly, I believe, mostly from Muehlhäuser, either as an individual or him as president speaking on behalf of the synod. Um, how much of this have to do with him? And is that maybe why it's kind of a fading memory in Wells
Yeah.
historiography? Was this just a him thing? And because he was in leadership, it has that much weight in those early years.
Yeah. And my argument that is Muehlhäuser is a key figure here. The first president of the Wisconsin Synod had served previously before moving to Wisconsin in the New York Synod or New York Ministerium, a close partner of the Pennsylvania Synod. He is a key figure. But I think the what I'm trying to counteract is and you see this especially in J.P. Kaler's history, which we've referenced a couple times. History, by the way, I adore. He's one of my favorite figures in American Lutheran history. But he basically makes the argument in his history that basically the connection to Eastern Lutherans was just Muehlhäuser and his kind of personal relationship with Eastern officials. And what I'm trying to show is that actually there's much more to it than that. Yeah, yes, the relationship is initiated during Muehlhäuser's presidency, but it continues well after the presidency. The Wisconsin Synod is still sending these mission reports to the to the Pennsylvania Synod after Muehlhäuser steps down from president. It's asking for more support from the Pennsylvania Synod. At one point, like they say something along the lines, our only complaint is that we wish you were sending more money. And they keep asking, can you send us actually pastors too? So and the Pennsylvania Synod is encouraging the Wisconsin Synod to kind of build up its own institutions. When Northwestern, uh, well, it's called Northwestern University at one point. We can just call it
Hmm.
Northwestern, and there's the seminary on campus too. Is for the Pennsylvania Synod is saying, go for it. This is great. We're establishing more sound Lutheranism in the Midwest. And even some of the early faculty at Northwestern have these connections to the East. Adam Martin, the first president of Northwestern, gets his start oh, now I'm trying to remember. I wrote this article. I should remember this. Was he actually a member of the Pennsylvania Synod, or I mean, he was closely affiliated, but he's from the
Yeah.
Eastern United States. And so, yeah, so these connections, I make the argument, persist after Muehlhäuser's presidency. They're just as strong, and in fact, you might even say they're getting stronger because, and this is a key point I'm trying to make in the article. Uh, when the Wisconsin Synod joins the General Council, it's not this kind of strange one-off event. It's the culmination of this long partnership with the Pennsylvania Synod. And so yeah, I would say Muehlhäuser is important, but it's more than just his relationship with people back in the East.
Yeah. And the role of having a college and a seminary can't really be overstated too much how important that was for the Wisconsin Synod kind of coming to its own in those days and having that financial support and especially at the college, like you said, that personnel support. Um, I think, yeah, there's a favorite dissertation of yours that now I've liked reading too that really talks about that. I'll talk about it later today as well, but just it started off, Northwestern started off as kind of this American, almost English language
Yes.
model. Harvard of the West, I think I've heard it was the model for Northwestern. And you could tell Northwestern University kind of
Yeah.
has this lofty aspiration. And It flipped after a while to be a much more standard German
Right.
gymnasium supported style. So that to me seems a big argument too for a East Coast American Pennsylvania influence.
Right. But even there, so Adam Martin, who has this kind of like he wants the Northwestern University to be modeled after these Eastern liberal arts colleges. He leaves, basically he's, kicked out for he kind of opposes the Wisconsin Synod leaving the general council. But the new president, August Ernst, also is a former Pennsylvania Synod person, right? So
Hmm.
even there you still have the connections. So both of the more, Americanizing, if you will, Adam Martin and the more, wanting to replicate in some ways the German gymnasium model in Ernst. Both of these have extensive Pennsylvania connections. So, I say once you start seeing the connections between the Wisconsin Synod and the Pennsylvania Synod, you start seeing them all over the place.
Yeah. So I guess we'll take our side trip over to Minnesota in just a minute, but would you say the high watermark of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania is the General Council, where, hey, we're two independent church bodies, but now we're in a very
Yes.
formal fellowship relationship? Yeah. So do you want to talk about Wisconsin's brief time in the General Council? Why would they join it so quickly and leave it so quickly? That
Right.
must have been a huge time of transition. And I know 1868 is kind of your favorite year as far as big years.
Yeah.
But yeah, what do you want to say
Yeah,
about
no,
that?
it is in many it's this I mean, again, history is complicated, and that's what makes it so fun. It's at the same moment that you have this, again, culmination of the partnership. And I would say in many ways it's the high watermark. It's like what that relationship has in some ways been building towards. You're also having people within the Wisconsin Synod that are looking to move in a more, yeah, even more conservative direction. Um, so I mean, it's just interesting the type of, you have different. I mean, a key person here, I think, I keep coming back to this, is Johannes Bading, who is the second president of the Wisconsin Synod, has a brief time away from the presidency, and then comes back in 1867. He really emerged to me as the key figure in questioning the relationship with the Pennsylvania Synod. I mean, there are others as well. I think Adolf Heinecke is another person. But it's really, I think, Boding's leadership that just at the same point that the Wisconsin Synod is culminating in this relationship with the Pennsylvania Synod, he thinks that actually the better direction to go is the Missouri Synod. And for theological reasons, I think maybe some practical reasons too. Although what I discovered in my research, and I had no idea about this before, was there's kind of a very brief but important, I don't know, dalliance, you might say, with the Iowa Synod.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, which had you known about that much
That
before?
popped up in Peter Prange's books.
Oh, that's right. It did. Yes. Yeah,
So
that's
that's where I
right.
was made aware of it. But yeah,
Yeah,
Iowa was dabbling in Wisconsin territory
right.
for a while too. So yeah, that
Right.
and it kind of similar grounds of confessional German to
right.
what degree, right?
Right. And so the Iowa Synod, of course, is not their kind of nemesis to some degree is the Missouri Synod.
Hmm.
Um, so interesting, the Iowa Synod ends up pseudo joining the General Council, right? They're in the association with it, but never officially joined. But they're the ones initially that raised these questions about the General Council stand on church fellowship questions, pulpit fellowship, altar fellowship. And in many ways, their arguments kind of persuade people like Botting that the general council isn't sound on those points. But they're not, you can't be in fellowship with the Iowa Synod and the Missouri Synod. You kind of have to choose which one. And it's the
Yeah.
Missouri Synod that ends up, if you will, winning the day. So yeah, it is this kind of interesting thing that the culmination of uh, the this relationship is also the beginning of the end to the relationship. So
Yeah, almost instantly.
Yeah.
A very, very short time.
Yeah. Yeah. It's 2 years that the Wisconsin Synod is in and there's even technic I mean, what's interesting, they declare fellowship with the Missouri Synod while they're still technically a member of the General Council. It's this
Yeah.
kind of, again, these curious times of transition and everything's kind of in flux.
Yeah, now that you mention that, that must have been the high watermark of WELS fellowship with other Lutherans then, right?
Yeah.
In fellowship with all the General Council and
Right. Yeah,
Missouri.
that's
Yeah.
true. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. That'd be funny to chart that out sometime and see the overlap over time. But yeah. Well, good. Well, and I think a major point, and in this WELS anniversary year, kind of by default, um, since we have the Wisconsin Synod has now inherited two, three other synods' histories, you do have
Right.
to tell the other synods' histories too. If unless you're going to say it's just odd to celebrate the Minnesota Synod's 175th anniversary. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's kind of hard to plug into the narrative all the time. However, at this time, you brought out a beautiful overlap of the Minnesota Synod's history. And I would say in my readings and research now, Minnesota and Wisconsin histories are much more parallel by far than Michigan, for
Yeah.
example, seem to be sharing a lot more earlier on, including some founding pastors. But and maybe that's because of Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah.
So, what did you want to say about the birth of the Minnesota Synod, and maybe
Yeah.
triangulate that with Wisconsin and Pennsylvania?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that the Minnesota Pennsylvania relationship is maybe even deeper. And I think that's because of the figure of CF Hire, or Father Hire, as he often is known. It's him and another important figure in American Lutheran history, William Passavant, who are in many ways, really two key figures in the early history of the Minnesota Synod. So I'll first mention Passavant. He is a pastor in Pittsburgh. He's not a member of the Pennsylvania Synod. He's a member of the Pittsburgh Synod, but he's a key leader in the kind of Eastern confessional movement. And he's also very interested in um, missions in the Western United States. In fact, his church paper that he edits is called The Missionary, right? So it's kind of the confessional alternative to some Eastern Lutheran church papers, but it's also promoting mission work abroad and at home. And he goes on this tour to Minnesota where he's basically like, hey, we need to start a Lutheran congregation here, especially in St. Paul, Minnesota, the kind of the center of this emerging territory. It's not yet even a state. And the person who ends up accepting that position is Hire, who I mentioned. He's a background in the Pennsylvania Synod, had served as the first missionary to India from the United States, from U.S. Lutheranism. He's in his 60s when he moves out to Minnesota, which, I mean, what a guy. I mean,
Yeah.
and he moves to St. Paul, starts a congregation, which is initially supposed to be an English Lutheran congregation, but eventually becomes a German, predominantly German Lutheran congregation. And he begins kind of making connections with the few other scattered Lutheran congregations in Minnesota, and then leads in the formation of the Minnesota Synod. And very quickly, the Minnesota Synod enters a very similar relationship to what the Wisconsin Synod has. It gets an annual stipend from the Pennsylvania Synod to support pastors. It sees itself as kind of the daughter of the Pennsylvania Synod. It has its mission reports printed in the Pennsylvania Synod's mission minutes. Pennsylvania Synod refers to the Minnesota pastors as our missionaries, those kind of things. I'd say it's what makes the Minnesota connection even deeper is, among other things, the Minnesota Synod follows the Pennsylvania Synod's lead and joins the General Synod for a very brief time, joins in 1864. Interestingly, at the same time that the Pennsylvania Synod is beginning to question its membership in the General Synod, but then it follows the Pennsylvania Synod out of the General Synod into the General Council. And so yeah, I would say even more so than the Wisconsin Synod. or at the very least, it's a very similar relationship, but maybe even deeper in Minnesota.
Yeah, so now even numerically, if you were to graph this out, Pennsylvania is just huge, right?
Yeah,
Financially, membership, pastor-wise. I'm kind of seeing it now as kind of the center of this moderate to more becoming more confessional with age
yeah,
group of Lutherans, and you get these little Midwest synods are kind of in the orbit of
yeah,
Pennsylvania until they kind of grow up and go their own way, both Minnesota and Wisconsin. And Minnesota Synod was always smaller than the Wisconsin Synod. But yeah, just kind of the way I'm picturing it. It's interesting. I don't know if you had a chance to see it yet. I just in the WELS Historical Journal translated a section from Moldenke and an autobiography, and he's talking about his time as a Reiseprediger, and he's
hmm
in my neck of the woods, Wausau, but he almost dies like 10 times, it seems, just trying to cross the Mississippi
yeah,
and Minnesota River. He's in Minnesota. Well, anyway, he's probably much more of that moderate Lutheran character
yeah,
as well, very friendly to the East, and he actually goes back to Germany, and I think he ends up in New York, if I'm not mistaken.
yes, that's
Um,
correct.
okay.
Eventually becomes a president of the General Council. Yep.
Well, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And he kind of just like he just pops up in Wells history and then he disappears and
yeah.
there's so much more to his story. But well,
Oh,
anyway, he
I could
says
talk about him. He's fascinating to me.
we should do a Moldenki episode
Yeah,
then because
yeah,
we both kind of have
yeah,
chased some of his stuff. But anyway, I'm just remembering one line where he says, "Yeah, the Wisconsin Synod is it's not hopeless, but man, and this he's writing like 1868. So as it's moving more confessional,
yeah.
he's kind of I think he's worried by that. But he says they don't have the right connections to supply enough pastors for all these preaching stations. But that Minnesota Synod, it's gonna um, have things figured out. I think he's a little
Interesting.
more optimistic. So I don't know if that's
Yeah,
because he sees them at that time still having stronger ties um, with the East, and I think that's maybe part of it is Minnesota's a little more uh, perhaps loyal to
it
Pennsylvania,
is. It remains
but
in
yeah,
the
we're
general. Yeah, it remains in the General Council for a longer period until 1871. But I should mention, like already, even in its early history, you mentioned this kind of triangulation. There are Wisconsin Synod pastors moving into Minnesota
yeah
to take positions there. I talked about one in my article, Gottlieb Fachtman,
yeah
who becomes kind of second to higher in
hmm
importance in the early Minnesota history, and he's one that actually ends up opposing the movement of the Minnesota Synod away from the, Pennsylvania Synod General Council and ends up basically resigning and becoming a independent pastor in Minnesota. So
yeah.
yeah,
Fachman seems to have Muehlhäuser vibes, so to speak.
yeah,
Just kind
yeah.
of that same.
Although, I mean, the thing is, I mean, Muehlhäuser, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Someone needs to write a biography of him. I mean, he's just fascinating to me. Like, but anyway,
Well, we need to write a like a mini or the first generation of Wells leaders do a mini series because Moldenke is fascinating,
yeah,
Fachman's fascinating, yeah.
yeah,
Throw Botting in there, yeah.
yeah.
But well, yeah. Well, now we're just having fun talking about all of the first generation. But so how does Minnesota though eventually leave to general
Right,
council and Pennsylvania because that happens too.
right. So the key person that, in my view, that leads the Minnesota Synod out of the General Council and into complete fellowship with the Wisconsin Synod, and then eventually the Missouri Synod and the Synodical Conference is Henry Seeker, who was interestingly the one person who studied at the Gettysburg Seminary in the Wisconsin
Hmm.
Synod's partnership with the Pennsylvania Synod at that institution. But he comes back to Wisconsin, uh, pastors the congregation in Granville, right? Salem, Granville. I'm getting
Hmm.
that right. West Grand. I'm not a Wisconsin geography
I think
maestro
that's
here.
correct.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The kind of one of the mother congregations,
Yeah.
and but then moves to Minnesota, and he's the one that is really the key figure in, yeah, the direction we're going to go is toward the the Wisconsin, Missouri, eventually the Synodical Conference. And interestingly, then Seeker later becomes a Missouri Synod pastor in New York, further down the line. So the, to me, at least in the telling of my article, he ends up being the key figure in making that move. Higher, he leaves the Minnesota Synod in the actually goes back to India for a brief time in his 70s.
Mm.
He'll actually finish out his life as the, I mean, they called him like the house father, basically kind of like the chaplain slash dorm supervisor at the General Council Seminary in Philadelphia. So that's where he finishes his. So Heyer basically returns back into the Pennsylvania Synod fold late in his final days. So it's kind of again this new generation of people in the Minnesota Synod that Seeker being the most prominent that leads them in that direction.
Yeah, and now I can picture him now. There's the synod that did one of the best history books of all time is the Minnesota Synod's 50th anniversary book. I don't know if you've
Yes.
seen it. They have
Yes.
pictures of every single pastor and every
Yep.
single church, I believe, are pretty close to it. And Seeker's in there, one of the big pictures up front. But if you ever need to know, well, what does this pastor look like? If he's in the Minnesota Synod in the first 50 years, you're doing
Yeah.
okay.
But and here's just another again. Now we're again as we tend to do go down these interesting rabbit holes. Interestingly, though, in my research, I discovered that there's some minor errors in the telling of the very earliest history of the Minnesota
No?
Synod
Okay.
because um, I don't know if Kaler was never able to get the official minutes from these first meetings of the Minnesota Synod, but they were actually printed in William Passavant's journal, The Missionary.
Hmm.
And so there's a few people there that aren't in like Kaler's history. And so both the first organizing meeting in 1858, where it's like getting kind of the idea of the Minnesota Synod together, and then also the first official meeting in 1860. Um, these are uh, these are, as far as I know, only printed in that journal, The Missionary, edited by
Yeah.
Passavant. And then another interesting thing, and again showing these deep connections, the official printed minutes of the Minnesota Synod begin in 1864. But our Synod archives only has them in 1867 and on. But
Hmm.
interestingly, you know where those ones from 1864, 1865, 1866 are kept at one of the seminaries in Pennsylvania. So
Really? Did Hire
yeah,
just like take them with him or yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I haven't accessed them yet.
Yeah.
I'd like to see them because I've seen all the minutes from that we have in our Synods archives. And by the way,
Yeah.
let me just get since we're just going down all kinds of tangents, I just need to give a shout out like Susan Willems at the WELS Archives was tremendously helpful in putting this article together. She scanned so many letters for me. It was amazing. The folks over at the Lutheran Archive Center in Philadelphia, I took a research trip out there. Amazing. They do such a great job of keeping of preserving these important documents in Lutheran history. When I got to Philadelphia and on my hunch, I thought I was going to find something. And lo and behold, I find original letters from Wisconsin Synod pastors in
Mm,
the Pennsylvania Ministerium archives. It was like, wow, this is,
yeah.
who's read these in,
Yeah.
over 150 years? Who knows,
Right.
So, so hopefully,
That
yeah, yeah. But anyway.
super
So
exciting though. Yeah.
it is that's the
Yeah.
best is finding completely new things. Yeah,
Where no Wells historian has ever even
right. And
conceived
maybe
of these,
no and maybe no other historian because I mean it's usually only going to be Wisconsin Synod people who are writing about the Wisconsin
Yeah,
Synod.
a
So
footnote. Yeah,
yeah,
there's some of the books that claim to cover Lutheranism in North America for the last couple decades. Wells is few and far between in there.
Yeah.
your
Well,
tellings, but
that's
maybe I got a chip on my shoulder.
a
Or I think what even at the best point, we're only 5% of all Lutherans in America. But still,
right.
such a long history as is being pointed out this year is
Yeah,
almost unparalleled as a institution. So,
that's true. Yep. Yep.
well, I guess any other main points you want to make about your article before we talk about kind of some concluding remarks here?
Um, no, I mean, I think we covered all the bases. I don't want to rehash the whole thing. I think maybe I'd say, well, maybe these are kind of more concluding thoughts. I think what the one thing that the article is trying to show is that you really can't understand the history of the Wisconsin Synod and then also, the Minnesota Synod, Michigan Synod, those that eventually formed the WELS without kind of understanding the complete picture of American Lutheranism at the time, right? So it's not as if
Hmm.
and I know no one believes this, no one says it like this, but you can't isolate the Wisconsin Synod, or the Minnesota Synod, Michigan Synod from, they're part of this larger flux of American Lutheranism in the 19th century. And I think hopefully one thing I show is how the Wisconsin Synod fits into that context.
Yeah. That's a good takeaway point, I think, of yeah, you got to know this story to know our story. So do you hope further research is done on this topic? I don't want to say it's a narrow topic because it actually touches on a much broader
Yeah.
concept of just Wisconsin Synod connectivity with other Lutherans.
Yeah.
And maybe we within the Synod we view ourselves as maybe being insulated or isolated from
Yeah.
others due to fellowship, but that was almost the opposite case in many ways. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and just that comparison. But um, yeah, do you hope others do further research on this or further writing on this general topic or do
Oh,
something
for
with your
sure.
article? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're kind of my two big hopes. One is that, when we tell the story of the early Wells history, that I mentioned at the beginning, we have those kind of two plot lines, right? The movement away from the German mission societies, the movement toward the Missouri Synod, that we have a third plot line in the mix too when we tell the story. And it's the relationship partnerships with, again, not just the Pennsylvania Synod, but with other Eastern Lutherans and just, yeah, fitting the Wisconsin Synod in that larger context. I hope that's a takeaway that people have. And then, yeah, I mean, there's always more to discover. We're just talking about all these figures that, boy, there could be more work done. I mean, one just to give you a sense of like, there's always more to discover. I was for another project, I was looking at the memoirs of Henry Eister Jacobs. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with him.
Yeah.
He's one of the kind of successors to Charles Porterfield Krauth as a leading theologian in the General Council. And so I'm looking through his memoirs, and lo and behold, I come across a section where he talks about at one point he was called to serve at Northwestern
Mm.
University in Watertown, right? And his big hang up for it was at the time, this is right as the Wisconsin Synod is moving into its relationship with the Missouri Synod, is he did not want to be in fellowship with the Missouri Synod.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, again, like it's one of those things once you know the depth of the relationship there, like you start seeing these connections all over the place. And so yeah, so I hope yeah more people take up these different threads and we more Lutheran history the better,
All right. That
which is
sounds
the theme
good.
of your podcast, it seems.
More or less, yeah. Well, it's its purpose at least. If I know I can't even come close to doing it all, so we have good conversations with those who do. So, thank you again, Dr. Grundmeier, for joining us today in another uh, episode covering another aspect of Wells history.
Thanks for having me, Ben.